In this week's lesson, we're going to look at the Greek case system, which applies particularly to nouns, but also to pronouns, adjectives, the definite article, the word the, and other forms that resemble nouns. So, for example, when we get to participles, many, many weeks from now. With the Greek verb, we saw that really the verbal system of Greek was very much like the verbal system of English. There's very little that can be expressed in English that can't be expressed somehow in Greek, and vice versa. The challenge for us learning Greek is not the framework, the conceptual framework of the system, but rather learning how Greek communicates particular facets of that system. The same thing will hold true for Greek nouns and figuring out what role each noun in a Greek sentence is playing. Because once again, the roles are pretty much the same in Greek as in English. It is the way in which that role is being communicated to the Greek hearer or the Greek reader that is so very different and therefore confusing. Now, in an English sentence, we can typically find a subject and a direct object. Very often, an indirect object, and some other nouns fulfilling other roles. For example, a noun might give us the location of the action. It would be a locator. A noun might give us the instrument, name the instrument by means of which the main action happened. It might function as a descriptor of another noun in the sentence. It might be an agent, that entity by whose activity the action happened. All of these roles that a noun can play are familiar to us in English. And in English, we recognize the role that a given noun is playing, chiefly based upon word order, where that word shows up in relation to the verb, or upon prepositional phrases. Does a particular preposition precede that noun? These are the ways in which English establishes the role that each noun or a noun substitute like a pronoun would play in a sentence. For us in English, we know that a noun is the subject of the verb because it appears before the verb. We know that a noun is the direct object of a verb because it appears after the verb. Thus in English, the woman evangelized the man. We know that the woman is the one doing the evangelizing because the noun the woman appears ahead of the verb. We know that the man is the one who has been evangelized because he appears after the verb. In English, subjects almost always precede the verb and direct objects come after the verb. If we were to switch these around, we would quite potentially confuse our hearer or our reader in English. One of the things about 17th, 16th, and 17th century English literature that tends to throw readers is the tendency of poets of that period to play around with English word order enough to sometimes raise questions. Hey, which of these nouns is a subject, which is a direct object? We have very little tolerance for that in modern English. If a preposition like to or for appears before a noun, that signals to us that that noun is probably acting as the indirect object of the sentence. That is to say, the noun is that which receives the action in some sense, but not quite as directly as the direct object. Thus, I threw the ball to my son. In that sentence, I represents the subject, the ball the direct object, because that is the noun, that is in fact being hurled through the air. Sun represents the indirect object. Sun is the target of the trajectory of the ball, of the throwing, but is not actually experiencing being hurled through the air like the ball is. A locator, a noun that tells us where the action is happening, shows up in a prepositional phrase beginning with in or on or among or some such preposition. So I threw the ball to my son in the park. We know that the noun park is giving us the location of the action based on its appearance together with the preposition in. An agent appears in a prepositional phrase beginning with the word by. The ball was thrown by the pitcher. In a passive construction like that, the ball was thrown. We often have the agent, the one who did the actual throwing, expressed somewhere in the sentence, and that is with the preposition by preceding the noun. Instrument is indicated by prefacing the noun that is the instrument with a preposition like by or with. Here I somehow revert to the sentences that I heard learning classical Greek, where it was all basically military text, but the general killed the barbarian with a sword. The general is the subject, the barbarian is the direct object of the action of the sentence, killing. Sword is the instrument by means of which the killing happened, and we know that because in English it is preceded with the preposition with. The general killed the barbarian with a sword. The general punished the rebellious city by besieging. Okay, that's a bad example because besieging isn't a noun, but you get the idea. We can even make one noun describe another noun in English by introducing that noun with the preposition of. Thus, in the expression throne of gold, we hear that the noun gold is describing another noun, throne, somehow. Probably in this case telling us what the throne is made out of. So all of these roles or functions that a noun can occupy in a sentence are very clear to us. They're second nature, and we know how to recognize them instinctively without ever really thinking through any of the language on the slide in front of you. So, for example, take the sentence, the people in the city sent gifts of gold to the king in Pergamum by ship. If you were to stare at this slide for a moment and press pause, you could probably tell which noun is fulfilling which role here. Subject, direct object, indirect object, locator, descriptor, instrument. There isn't an agent, I just threw that up there for completeness. So press pause and try to figure that out. If you saw that the people sent gifts is the core of this sentence, then you are probably able immediately to see that people is the subject, gifts is the direct object, and this by the positioning of these two nouns in regard to the verb sent. Then the noun city and the proper noun Pergamum show up as locators, and we know that they're locators because they're prefaced by in. The word gold is a descriptor. It is telling us something about the nature of the gifts. And we know this because it is prefaced with a preposition of. And finally, we know that ship is telling us something about how the action of sending was accomplished. And we know that because ship is prefaced with the word by. We could do a similar analysis on the second sentence. The gospel was proclaimed by apostles of Jesus in the synagogues. Here, too, if you wish to press pause, go ahead and try to figure it out. Here, the gospel is the subject. It appears before the verb, and the verb here is a passive one this time. The gospel was proclaimed. In a passive construction, there won't be a direct object, because the subject is really the recipient of the action. The gospel is what is being proclaimed. But in this kind of construction, we do have an agent, signaled by a noun preceded by the word by. Who did the proclaiming? Apostles. The gospel is proclaimed by apostles. Jesus, we know, is a descriptor in this sentence. It's a proper name, it's a noun, but it is describing another noun, signaled again by the word of. What apostles? Whose apostles? The apostles of Jesus. And again, the word synagogues, gives us the location of this action. We know that because of the preposition in. So all these roles and the rules for figuring out instinctively at our age what role a particular noun is fulfilling are all very familiar to us in English. When we turn to Greek, we're going to find that a Greek speaker or a Greek writer relies far less on word order than we do, though I will say word order is still often important in a Greek sentence. It's not completely haphazard or an anything goes sort of situation. And Greek relies less on prepositions than English does, although Greek also has a well-developed system of prepositions. Instead, Greek relies on a system of cases and on the ability to change the way a noun ends, to communicate the case of each noun clearly. As we saw with the Greek verb, with the present active indicative, you have part of the word that communicates clearly the meaning, in the case of the verb, the action that is being expressed. Lego, leg communicates the action of speaking. And the ending can be changed to indicate who's doing the speaking. Similarly with the Greek noun, you have part of the noun, the stem, that talks about the thing being named. So for example, with the word kurios, you have part of that, the first part of that word, kuri, signaling the meaning. Lord is being talked about or named. The last part, in this case, os, kurios, is the part that can appear in a variety of forms, and the form tells you what case the noun is being put into, and the case of the noun communicates the range of functions that noun might have in the sentence. Thus, for almost all of the kinds of roles or functions we've been exploring so far in this presentation, the ending of the Greek noun will be the signal for what role that noun has. It will not be word order, and it will not be some preposition ahead of that noun giving us that signal. We will begin then to have to look very closely at the ending of a noun, and the ending of the noun to determine what case that noun is in. And once we know the case, then we can ask, well, what function is that noun going to have in this sentence? And then those functions will be what we've been exploring: subject, direct object, indirect object, locator, descriptor, instrument. Now, as we move into this case system, we will meet 5 words that are probably going to be strange to most students. Nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, and vocative. These are names derived from Latin words, from Latin grammarians, talking about the Latin language and the Greek language. The nominative case is the case of naming. It is the basic noun case, as it were. Nouns name things. In the nominative case, a word is simply naming something. When we find that a noun is in the nominative case, and we find that by looking at its ending, then we know that that noun will be functioning either as the subject of the sentence, or it will be a word that renames the subject of the sentence, or it will supply the predicate nominative in a sentence where the main verb is something like is, or the equivalent. Let me explain this a little bit more. In the sentence, "The Lord reigns over the earth," in Greek, the word for Lord, kurios, would be in the nominative case, and in that sentence, it represents the subject of the sentence, who's doing the reigning. In the sentence, "The Lord is God," this is an equative sentence. So we would find nominatives on both sides of the word is. The Lord is technically the subject, and it will appear in the nominative case, but God is simply renaming the subject. And so the word for God in Greek, theos, incidentally, will also appear in the nominative case. If we were to have the sentence, "Christ, comma, the Lord, comma, is God," Christ would be the subject, the Lord would be renaming the subject, and God would still be the predicate, that which is predicated of Christ the Lord. So all three nouns would appear in the nominative case. In Greek, a noun in the accusative case tends to signal the direct object of the verb. So instead of relying on word order, we're going to find the subject in front of the verb and the direct object behind the verb. We are going to have to rely on case identification. The noun that we find in the nominative case will be the subject of the verb. The noun that we find in the accusative case will be the direct object of the verb. And therefore in Greek, the accusative, the direct object, can very easily come in front of the verb, and the subject can come behind the verb, and no Greek speaker or reader would be confused by this, because here's a point at which word order doesn't matter, but case ending does. The dative case in Greek covers three very important functions. First, a noun in the dative case could be the indirect object of the sentence, or it could be the location in which the action takes place, or it could be the instrument by means of which the action takes place. The important thing to note here is that in Greek you will not find any preposition in front of the noun that is the indirect object, like you do in English. We signal this with to or for, but Greek does not. Or instrument, we signal this with by or with, but Greek generally does not. Similarly with location, although increasingly in Hellenistic era Greek, you do find the preposition en, which is the Greek word for in, before a noun signaling location, but you don't always, and you certainly don't have to. So when you find a Greek noun in the dative case, you'll have to decide, based on context, whether this noun is going to function as the indirect object, a locator, or as the instrument of the action. Similarly, in Greek, the genitive case indicates description, as opposed to finding the preposition of, which simply does not exist in Greek at all, as the marker that a noun is functioning as a descriptor. You'll simply find a noun in the genitive case. And in fact, the genitive case is the most fluid case in Greek. It has a wide variety of possible functions or senses to it. But for now, it is simply important to associate the genitive case with the marking of a noun as a descriptor of another noun. Finally, there is the vocative case. This is vestigial in Hellenistic Greek. There are very few special forms by this period for vocatives. Very often this function is absorbed by the nominative case, but it's still treated across the board as an independent case, and the vocative case is used for direct address. When Peter calls out to Andrew to get his attention, the name Andrew, or the word brother, appears in the vocative case. Andrew, get over here! Andrew would be in the vocative case. Or, a little bit more sublime, an example, when we call upon the Lord. Kyrios in Greek. Kyrios is the nominative case for Lord. It's simply the form that names Lord, as in the Lord is God. But Kyrie, with a different ending, the vocative case ending, is the form used to cry out to the Lord. Thus, very often in the Gospels, people cry out to Jesus, thus calling for help. Or the Psalms in Greek are full of vocative forms, calling out to God or to the Lord. Now, there are another two things in regard to Greek nouns of which we need to be aware, and that is gender and number. The first is going to be truly odd to us English speakers because our nouns do not have grammatical gender. We don't have a category of masculine nouns and feminine nouns and neuter nouns. But many modern languages do. So if you're familiar with Spanish or French or German, you are familiar with the concept of nouns having grammatical gender. In some instances, the decision to allocate a particular noun to one gender or another makes sense based on the meaning of the noun. Girl, mother, wife, these are always represented by feminine nouns in modern languages. Similarly, brother, uncle, father, boy, these are always represented by masculine nouns. But then a great number, the fact that a great majority of nouns are assigned to a particular gender without there being anything inherently masculine, feminine, or neither about the noun itself. There is nothing particularly masculine about a book, but it is le livre in French. It is grammatically masculine. There is nothing particularly feminine about a fish, but in French it is la poisson. It is a feminine noun. Similarly, in Greek, every noun is assigned to a gender, and only one gender. Kyrios will always be masculine. It will never, that particular noun will never show up as feminine or neuter. Ecclesia, the word for church, will always be feminine. It will not sometimes be masculine, sometimes feminine, sometimes neuter. It will be assigned to one gender. Very often that will seem random to us. Number makes a little bit more sense because even in English we have singular and plural forms. Lord is a singular noun. Lords is a plural noun. So that concept isn't so far removed from our everyday speech. What is going to be different is that then there are different forms for the singular nominative noun and the plural nominative noun, and different forms for the singular genitive noun and the plural genitive noun, all the way down the line. So when we talk about Greek nouns, and when we analyze Greek nouns, we will be talking in terms of their gender, their number, and their case. Their case is essential to their function in the sentence. Their number, of course, is essential to knowing if there's one of them or more than one of them. so it's a basic issue of understanding. Gender comes into play more when we need to determine if a particular adjective in a sentence is describing a particular noun in the sentence, because there will always be agreement between a noun and its descriptors, like adjectives or the definite article the, or other such words, in gender, number, and case. Now, as we move into the lessons this week, we will encounter a number of paradigms. This time, we're not dealing technically with conjugation, which is the name given to making the different forms of a verb, but to declension, the forms of a noun or noun-like words. Now, just for interest's sake, there is a rationale for the different words here. Conjugation comes from the Latin to join together, and essentially with verbs, one is joining together a verb stem, verb endings, and other verbal elements that might indicate what tense that verb is, or what have you. With a declension, one is declining a word with its ending and moving through a set of endings that really are part of the word but are being morphed as you go from one case to the other. So we have this nomenclature: conjugating for verbs, declining for nouns. The first set of nouns that you'll encounter are nouns of the first declension. What that means is simply nouns following this first set of ending patterns that we're going to learn together. And it just so happens that the vast majority of the nouns that follow this ending pattern are feminine nouns, like ecclesia, meaning assembly or church, or agape, meaning love. I'm not going to pretend that there's really rhyme or reason to the endings that we're going to witness here, at least not until we get to the third declension and we can begin to compare some very different forms together. I will simply say that it will be greatly advantageous for you to commit to memory the forms of the first declension. Now, the good news is that the plural forms are going to be the same across the first declension. But the singular forms fall into one of three major patterns. The pattern that has eta all the way down through all the endings, and the pattern that has alpha all the way down through all the endings. And you will know which pattern a noun follows because in the vocabulary it's given with its nominative singular ending. So if you see adelphe with the eta, you know you're going to be looking at this first set of endings, the eta-based endings. With ecclesia in the vocabulary, you see the alpha at the end. You're going to know that you're going to follow the alpha-based endings. And I would work through a paradigm all the way down, just as I urge you to do with the present active indicative. Don't think simply of the word adelphe, sister. Think of the entire paradigm to yourself so you begin to get used to the meanings or the senses that these cases bring to the noun. Adelphe, sister. Adelphes, of a sister. Adelphe, to or for a sister. Accusative, sister as direct object. Adelphe, vocative, sister, hey sister, as it were. And then in the plural, adelphi, sisters as subject. Adelphone, of sisters. Adelphais, 2 or 4 sisters. Adelphas, sisters, probably as direct object. Adelphai, hey, sisters. By the way, you'll always know you're dealing with a vocative because there'll be a comma after it in all printed editions of the Greek New Testament and also in the exercises. So that'll just be a little editorial clue that we're looking at a vocative as opposed to a nominative. Now, there is one bit of a snag in that there is also a mixed type in the first declension. That is to say, there are words that you'll encounter that in the vocabulary, for example, that end in alpha, but are not consistently going to follow the alpha pattern. Instead, they will start off with the alpha for the nominative, but then they'll flip to the eta sigma genitive ending, the eta with an iota subscript dative ending, and then they'll flip back to the alpha-based endings. This is known as the mixed first declension type, and here's the way to know, to predict whether a given word will follow the straight alpha or the mixed pattern. If, as you look at the vocabulary word, like ecclesia, if the letter right before that alpha, that is the nominative singular ending, if the letter right before that alpha is an iota, an epsilon, or a rho, then that noun is going to follow the straight alpha pattern. If the letter before that alpha ending is any other letter, it will follow the mixed ending. Now, in reality, you're not going to have to worry too much about predicting whether a given noun is going to follow the all alpha or the mixed ending. Your interest will be rather in knowing that when you see the eta sigma ending at the end of one of these first declension nouns, that you're looking at a genitive case noun, and therefore that noun is functioning in some way as a descriptor of another noun in this sentence. So in other words, you're not going to have to stress over, oh, ecclesia, is that the mixed type or the pure alpha type? Instead, your stress will come by looking at the ending of actual words and sentences, or eventually in New Testament or Septuagint texts, eta nu, and thinking, eta nu, which case ending is that for the noun? It's the accusative singular, so we're talking about one of these nouns, and it's probably functioning as a direct object in this sentence. Now, you're not just going to encounter this week nouns of the first declension, but in Lesson 4, also nouns of the second declension. And this pattern is the typical pattern for many masculine and neuter nouns. So the first declension tends to be associated with feminine nouns. The second declension tends to be associated with masculine and neuter nouns. And here there are differences within the second declension in some of the endings, depending on whether or not the noun is masculine or neuter. It says feminine here at the top of this particular chart, but there are in reality very few feminine nouns that follow this pattern. So once again, I would urge you to learn these endings and memorize them so that you associate the oo ending with the genitive singular, the o ending with its iota subscript with the dative singular, the ois ending with the dative plural. So when you see that ending, one of your first thoughts is, if this is a noun, I'm looking at a dative plural noun, and that's how I'm going to treat this. So I know it's going to be either probably the indirect object, or something about location, or something about the instrument used to get the action of the sentence done. And I would take some of the vocabulary words and I would work them through this entire paradigm. Kurios, that's Lord as probably the subject of a sentence. Kuriou, that's Lord as a descriptor, so probably of the Lord, as in the word of the Lord, logos kuriou. Kuriou there, the u signals that Lord is describing, telling us what kind of word this is. It is the word of the Lord. Kurio, with the omega and its little iota subscript ending, probably to or for the Lord. Kurion, accusative singular ending. Lord, probably as direct object of this sentence that I'm looking at. Kurie, calling out, Lord, Lord. Kurioi, lords in the plural as the subject, likely, of a sentence. Kurion, genitive plural, describing some other noun as somehow lords, of the lords, the worship of the lords, if you want to talk about idolatry, for example, in a strange and stilted way. Kuriois, to or for lords. Kurious, lords as direct object. And then take a neuter noun, like teknon, which means child, and work through the neuter second declension endings the same way, so you really begin to associate these cases, each case, with its function. And you begin to get in your head, okay, I need to really know the endings, all the possible case endings here. So when I see techno with the omega ending, I know that we're probably talking about child as the indirect object of this sentence. I should just point out the difference between agent and instrument. If the noun represents a person, like Lord and child both do, if they show up in the dative case, they will probably not be instrument, because Greek tends not to use the dative case to talk about people getting an action done, only about things being used, tools being used to get the action done. Which is why if we see kurio in the dative case, it's likely to be indirect object, not instrument. In some weird cases, it can in fact be location, like kurio in the Lord. So, then work through the vocabulary words, through the whole paradigm of those words, so that these patterns begin to really sink deep into your memory, so that you can spot them. When you see these endings, you can immediately say, okay, if I'm looking at a noun, I'm looking at a genitive plural of that noun, and so I know what kind of function to expect this noun to have in a sentence. Thus, your assignment, other than reading through the lessons until you understand the concepts, and I do hope that this presentation, though perhaps not scintillating, is helpful to that end. In addition to that, study the vocabulary, going through the whole paradigm for each noun, as I've suggested, and make sure that you're selecting the right paradigm. Within second declension, within lesson 4, make sure you're following the masculine or the neuter paradigm as required by the gender of the noun. And incidentally, that is clearly signaled in the vocabulary because the masculine nouns are given in the vocabulary ending with the syllable os, omicron, sigma. And it also will have the single letter omicron with the rough breathing, ha, after it. That is the nominative singular form for the for masculine nouns. More about articles are coming. Right now, really all you needed to know was that omicron sigma, ending the word in the vocabulary, tells you it is a masculine noun of the second declension. And ergon, for example, ending with omicron nu in the vocabulary, tells you it's a neuter noun of the second declension. Which, by the way, is a declension, is a pattern with some ambiguity, because unfortunately with these neuter nouns, the nominative and the accusative forms are identical. So you really don't know instantly by looking at the ending whether ergon is the subject or direct object in a sentence. You have to determine that based on context. Usually it is crystal clear, but not always. And then, with the first declension nouns, make sure you're thinking through the right pattern, whether the fully alpha-based or the fully eta-based or the mixed patterns, based on the rules I gave you for determining that. Then work through the practice and review sentences in both lessons, and remember, because this is critically important, determine the case of each noun before you assign to it any function in the sentence. Don't let word order mislead you. Just because a noun comes before the verb doesn't make it the subject. Just because a noun comes after the verb doesn't make it the direct object. The rules are different in Greek, and the ways in which case and therefore function is communicated in Greek is different. Then work through the English to Greek exercises again in both lessons. Once again, think very carefully about the grammatical function of each noun, and only then put it in the Greek case that communicates that function. So, for example, thinking about on page 21, the fourth English to Greek sentence, a house of death does not have laws. By the way, don't expect to be in any way edified by the practice and review or the English to Greek sentences. Their function is purely pedagogical for thinking through the Greek grammar, not for devotional value. We will begin to get some of that soon enough. So a house of death does not have laws. You have to think through in English, okay, which of these nouns, if any, is the subject? Which of these nouns, if any, is the direct object? It happens that a house is the subject. A house doesn't have laws, and laws is the direct object. So in what case do you put house? What number is house? Are we talking about one or more than one? Laws, if it's the direct object, what case do you put it in? And is it singular or plural? And then of death, what kind of function is of death? It's a descriptor. So what case communicates description in Greek? And are we dealing with a singular or plural noun? You have to think through all those things now, in addition to thinking through the verb, the present active indicative verb. Sometimes there might be an infinitive also in these sentences. Now, I hope you'll be able to view this video before our video equivalent of a face-to-face session, so that we can deal with any questions you have before you get too far into the exercises. But of course, we will have that opportunity then to make sure we're clear on this current week's material. I guess I should say the last week's material, the verb system and the present active indicative, as well as this new concept of cases as the key to determining noun function.